The second part of the presentation, I wanted to spend some time going over, all right, how do we actually get funding approved? Let's take it a little bit away from just general stakeholder management to specifically what are we looking to accomplish here in terms of financial improvement. So we'll talk a little bit about the overall sort of typical budgeting cycle kinds of things, and then a little bit about how we keep execs agreeing. So this is just the second part of the presentation that you have in the charts below. But what we've talked about is how do we keep the stakeholders, and in particular the leadership, sort of engaged with our project going forward. And one of the key things that you need to do is never forget that what we're trying to do with any of these projects, they've invested in this project. What they want out of it is some return. All right, they could invest that money that they're spending on this project in many other things, including municipal bonds, for Pete's sake, that will return 4%. So we need to be better than that. We need to show the value of what we're doing to the company. So, how do you do that? You do that a lot of times by stories. So outlining real waste examples due to poor processes that our project will fix. Those are really good ways to do that. People can wrap their arms around that. If you talk in terms of dollars, if you talk in terms of stories, people understand that, their experiences, and they can really get behind that kind of thing. And always talk in dollars, not technology. So even though we've got approval to move this thing forward, always bring it back to what are the dollars that we're saving the company by doing this, or what's the increases that they're going to be able to do with the added competitive advantage this project is bringing. Remember that highly compensated employees usually gain income from bonuses, which are going to be tied to some sort of performance metric. Okay, so if there's a division, your sponsor or some other stakeholder that's going to is going to be able to cut their operating expenses and increase their margin, or be able to grow their overall revenue, then you want to be able to tie this project to that and speak to that, right, in terms of what we're actually accomplishing. Always bring it back to the dollars, because that's what they're interested in. Focus on the metrics that affect those metrics to get their buy-in. In the plan itself, drawback scope, again, to improve the business as a whole without forgetting the processes that gain the buy-in in the first place. Okay, remember, your goal is to add value. So how do we do that? When we get into that second year, we're getting into budget cycles. Let's keep in mind that most data analytics projects are funded through internal research and development, IR&D or R&D budgets. And there's going to be, so what that means is they've taken profit. Usually the company will have some revenue and some margin associated with that revenue, right? They've paid for their costs, they're paid for all the costs of the company, but then there's some profit that they're making ahead. That profit, they're going to carve a part of that out and put it into a research and development budget. That's what funds these kinds of projects, like the kind we're doing. If it's an IT budget, project that is replacing an existing capability, and may be funded out of the operating costs, okay, in which case, yeah, it would be out of the costs. But either way, you're looking at some scarce resources that they're allocating to this project, and there's going to be continual downward pressure on it, regardless. If it's coming out of profit, like R&D, it's going to be especially, there's going to be a lot of focus on it to make sure that we're executing the cost. And if it's coming out of the O&M budget, the operating budget, then there's a continual downward pressure to reduce costs. The stockholders are looking at that. What are you doing in terms of costs? So there's a lot of competition. There's going to be knife fights for competing projects and desire to see results quickly so that they can justify to their stockholders what they're doing with this scarce resources that they have in terms of either profit that can be sent back to the stockholders in terms of dividends, or in terms of the operating costs, which really speaks to the overall health of the company. Those funding profiles can change pretty rapidly. So we might feel like we're in great shape with this project moving forward, but the relative priority may allow for funding decrease in a portfolio environment where other higher priority projects are coming online. So if we're in we're working on a sales system, okay, let's say, for example, and the manufacturing and part of the company runs into some real problems and they need some robotics in a hurry, guess what? That probably all the resources are going to be swept over to that. So always be ready to show that we are executable, that we are executing well, that the investment is there, it's going to be good. So if they do have to make a priority choice, it's going to have a significant cost because they can already bank in the revenue that we're going to be bringing them as executable and going to happen. So any perceived lack of progress can result in perceptions that the project is unexecutable or that may not actually give the results that they want. And when you open up that channel of communication, when you open up that line of thinking, then you can make your funding disappear really quickly in terms of other efforts, more promising efforts, or things that are maybe more critical to the business. Multi-year funding is particularly vulnerable for these kinds of things and the reason is that first year, it is very difficult to show progress. If you're in a 3-year project, you're not going to see anything in front of the customers until, year 2 or year 3. So you need buy-in on the vision, you need buy-in on the project management approach, absolutely, and you need to show execution in both those years. It's great if we can actually show from an agile programming environment, prototypes and things like that are actually deploying out, but if nothing else, we need to have those 3 engage with the stakeholders. The execution, showing that we're executing well, showing that our project management is executing, and showing that we are still lined up with the vision for the company and that we still are going to meet we're going to be able to allow them to meet the revenue targets or the cost reduction targets that they planned on. So when you're doing multi-year, the second and third years of the project are going to depend on continued perception of the need, continued perception of the priority, and then proven performance of program execution. So all those EVM numbers that we have go to speak to, hey, look, we're executing well. When you do go into the second year funding cycle, what you've got to do is say, look, we need the second year funding because here's what we can do, and here's what it's going to cost, and here's going to be the value. So just as you did the net present value for the initial project approval, right, you do it again for the second and third year. This year, it should be easier because all of that first year effort is now a sunk cost. Okay, so you don't have to go back and justify stuff that you've already spent. All you've got to say is, next year I need this much money, and my return on the company is going to be that much. It's still the total return that you had from the first year, except now your sunk costs can be ignored. This means that going into second, you have an even better story going into the second or potentially the third year. The problem IT projects run into is when they go into the second, third year and they haven't been managing their costs well, or they haven't been managing their risks, and all of a sudden they've got a cost that is the same as it was last year. Then leadership starts asking a question, is this ever going to end? When are we going to see the return on this thing? So we need to execute, but basically you have to make a case for that second year based on the cost that you're going to incur the second, third year. Stakeholder management is critical throughout this whole process. Don't wait until decision day to talk to your stakeholders, okay? You need to be having those conversations throughout the entire project. So when the time comes around for the second year of funding to be approved, because they go into that second year and they're going to decide what else they're going to go fund. When that second year funding needs to be approved, you've got people already lined up saying, well, absolutely, we're doing this project. We've been supporting this the entire year and it makes sense. You don't have to go and make some big case. You've already been building the case and reinforcing the case and identifying some of your non-supportive stakeholders and sort of mitigating their arguments well before you get into these things. So this is one of those projects that just gets set aside. We're going to go do it and then let them argue about the other projects that want future funding. So be aware of that process for your company. Know when they're going to have to make those decisions. Know when they're going to be having those meetings, when they're going to be having these kinds of conversations. Typically, it's a gated kind of effort. So what happens is in maybe the summer time frame, there'll be a first gate of projects. This is going to be like the first half of the year they're going to be discussing these. What are the things that we think make sense to go invest in next year? And they'll have some rough order of magnitude budgets associated with them. You remember what I talked about? Rough order of magnitude is anywhere from 50% less to 100% more, but it gives them some idea of the scope. Very small, very medium size, or very large projects. And then they'll kind of manage which ones they want to pursue within each of those sections based on the amount of revenue they're going to get. Second gate's usually going to be in the third quarter. And that's going to be when they make portfolio decisions based on those initial estimates. So they decided which ones make sense. Now they want to decide which ones are actually going to go into the portfolio. Third gate will be in the fourth quarter. So this is going into the actual budgeting for next year. They're going to allocate budgets based on the budgetary estimates that we give to them. You need strong stakeholder buy-in at each one of those gates. So at the first gate, you need your execs and your sponsor to someone to say, yes, we need this, go forward with it. Okay. Not you need someone in the business to do that. So the vision for the new project or the continuation of the project we're already on needs to have already been planted. Okay. The second gate, then, in the third quarter, when you're looking at that, you need to show why it's a priority. Among other projects, this is why this one is a priority. Again, the financial impact, show the financial impact, have your stakeholders ready to be lobbied. These are meetings that you're not necessarily going to be involved in, okay? So you need them in the court sort of defending you. The third gate is basically all you need to do there is show that you have confidence in your estimates. They know and understand what you're doing. You show execution. You're confident in your numbers. You're going to have this return, and your execution is going to be on target.